It was buried under a king's palace. Not hidden in a mountain. Not locked behind a great iron door. Not guarded by soldiers or protected by any special wall. Just buried, quietly, accidentally, completely, under centuries of collapsed mud, brick and windblown sand and the slow, patient weight of time pressing down on everything that human beings have ever built and abandoned and forgotten. Buried so thoroughly that for more than 2,000 years, not a single person walking across that dusty ground in what is now northern Iraq had any idea that directly beneath their feet lay something that would one day make historians and scholars and lovers of books and knowledge stop everything they were doing and simply stare in disbelief. The greatest library the ancient world had ever known was sleeping under the earth. And it was waiting, the way only truly important things can wait, without urgency, without impatience, without any doubt whatsoever that it would eventually be found. The story of how it was found begins not with a scholar or a scientist but with an empire. The British Empire, in the middle of the 19th century, was at the height of its power and confidence, and that power and confidence expressed itself in many ways, including a burning curiosity about the ancient world and a very particular kind of ambition that sent adventurous young Englishmen to the far corners of the earth not just to trade or to govern but to dig, to excavate, to bring back the buried treasures of ancient civilizations and place them in the great museums of London where they could be studied, admired, and added to the growing British sense that the entire history of the world was somehow their inheritance to collect and keep. One of those young Englishmen was named Austen Henry Laird. He was born in Paris in 1817, raised partly in Italy and partly in England, educated just enough to be ambitious and just restless enough to be dangerous. He was not a trained archaeologist. The discipline barely existed yet in any formal sense. He was not a linguist or a historian in the academic meaning of those words. He was something harder to define and in many ways more valuable. He was a man of extraordinary energy and curiosity and physical courage, someone who could sleep on hard ground and ride across deserts and negotiate with local chiefs and keep working through heat and illness and frustration that would have sent lesser people home on the first available boat. By his late 20s, Laird had already spent years traveling through Persia and Mesopotamia, developing a deep and genuine fascination with the ancient ruins he encountered everywhere in that region. The landscape of what is now Iraq is scattered with tells, the Arabic word for the low mounds of earth that form over centuries as ancient cities collapse and are built over and collapse again, layer upon layer of human habitation slowly accumulating into gentle hills that from a distance look completely natural but are in fact the compressed remains of thousands of years of human life. Laird had ridden past these tells for years and felt the same thing every time, a pull, a curiosity, a nagging feeling that the earth was trying to tell him something if only he would stop and listen. In 1845, with modest funding from the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire and a determination that more than compensated for everything else he lacked, Laird began excavating a great tell on the eastern bank of the Tigris River near the modern Iraqi city of Mosul. The tell was called Nimrud, and it turned out to be the ruins of an ancient Assyrian city called Kalhu, a place of enormous historical importance that yielded spectacular finds including giant stone sculptures of winged bulls and lions that Laird shipped back to London at enormous effort and expense, where they caused a sensation when they were installed in the British Museum. But Nimrud was not the greatest discovery waiting in that region. Nimrud was the beginning, the first chapter of a story that was still building toward something far more extraordinary. And that something was hiding just a few miles away, under a series of mounds near Mosul that the local people called Kuyunjik. Laird excavated there too, and in 1847 he began uncovering the ruins of a city so vast and so magnificent that its scale was almost incomprehensible, a city with walls so thick that ancient historians had written about them with awe, a city whose very name had become synonymous in the ancient world with wealth and power and ruthless imperial ambition. The city was Nineveh. And it had been the capital of the Assyrian Empire at the peak of its terrifying greatness. The Assyrians were one of the most formidable civilizations the ancient world ever produced. From their heartland in northern Mesopotamia, they built an empire that at its height stretched from modern Egypt to modern Iran, from the Persian Gulf to the mountains of Turkey. They were brilliant engineers and administrators. They were also terrifyingly effective warriors, and their reputation for brutal treatment of conquered peoples was so powerful that their name alone was enough to make distant kingdoms send tribute rather than face their armies in the field. The prophets of the Hebrew Bible wrote about Nineveh with a mixture of fear and condemnation that still crackles off the page 3,000 years later. It was, by any measure, one of the most important cities in the ancient world. And its greatest king, the man who took the Assyrian Empire to its absolute peak of power and sophistication, was a ruler named Ashurbanipal. Ashurbanipal came to the throne around 669 BC and ruled for more than 40 years. He was, by the standards of his time and place, a genuinely remarkable human being. He was a ferocious military commander who led campaigns that extended Assyrian power to its furthest reach. But he was also something that his predecessors had not been, something that distinguished him sharply from the long line of warrior kings who came before him. He was deeply, passionately, almost obsessively educated. In a world where most kings were proud of their military achievements and left the reading and writing to scribes, Ashurbanipal boasted in his own royal inscriptions that he had mastered the scribal arts, that he could read difficult ancient texts, that he understood mathematics and could solve complex problems, that he knew the secret knowledge of the learned men of his kingdom. He was not just a collector of power. He was a collector of knowledge. And so he did something that no ruler before him had ever done on such a scale. He sent agents, educated men, scribes, and scholars working on his direct orders, to every corner of his empire and beyond, with instructions to find, copy, or acquire every important written text they could locate. From the ancient temple libraries of Babylon and Nippur and Sippar, from the collections of scholars and priests and wealthy private individuals across Mesopotamia, from archives that had been accumulating knowledge for 1,000 years before Ashurbanipal was even born, from all of these places, texts were gathered, copied onto fresh clay tablets in the careful wedge-shaped script of cuneiform, and brought back to Nineveh. The result was something the ancient world had never seen before and would not see again for centuries. In the great palace at Nineveh, Ashurbanipal created a library, a systematic, organized, deliberately comprehensive collection of the accumulated written knowledge of Mesopotamian civilization. It contained tens of thousands of clay tablets. It contained medical texts describing symptoms and treatments and the names of herbs used to cure illness. It contained astronomical observations and mathematical calculations that showed the Assyrian scholars had mapped the movements of the planets with remarkable precision. It contained royal annals and historical records going back centuries. It contained religious texts and ritual instructions and prayers and incantations and the names and attributes of hundreds of gods. It contained dictionaries, lists of words in different languages, compiled by scholars trying to preserve knowledge of older tongues that were already fading from everyday use. And it contained stories. The oldest, greatest, most extraordinary stories that Mesopotamian civilization had ever produced. Including the one that a young self-taught scholar working in the British Museum would one day pull from a pile of broken tablet fragments and recognize, with shaking hands and a racing heart, as the oldest flood story in the history of human literature. But all of that was still in the future when Nineveh fell. In 612 BC, a coalition of enemies, Babylonians, Medes, and others who had suffered under Assyrian power for generations, descended on Nineveh and destroyed it so completely that within a few generations its very location had been forgotten. The palace burned. The great walls collapsed. The city that had dominated the ancient world for centuries became a ruin, and then a mound, and then nothing more than a feature of the landscape that local people walked across without knowing what lay beneath. The library went with it. The tens of thousands of clay tablets, arranged in their rooms and shelved in their careful order, all of it buried under the collapse of the burning palace. And here something remarkable happened, something that nobody planned or intended but that preserved the library far better than any deliberate act of conservation could have. The fire that destroyed the palace baked the clay tablets. Clay tablets are fragile when they are simply dried in the sun. They can be broken, dissolved by water, worn away by handling. But fired clay is a completely different material. Fired clay is ceramic, hard, and permanent, capable of lasting essentially forever under the right conditions. The catastrophe that ended Nineveh accidentally created the conditions that saved its library. And so the tablets waited. Under the rubble of the burnt palace, under centuries of accumulated debris, under the slow patient weight of time, they waited. Not perfectly. Many had been broken by the collapse of the building. Many had been damaged by the heat or the weight pressing down on them. But enough survived, and enough remained legible, that when a young assistant at the British Museum named Hormuzd Rassam excavated the site in the 1850s under Laird's broader direction and began finding tablet after tablet emerging from the earth, the knowledge they contained was still readable. Still real. Still speaking in the voice of a civilization that had been silent for 2,500 years. The tablets were shipped back to London in their thousands and deposited in the British Museum, where they sat in storage for years. Too numerous, too damaged, too complex for the small number of scholars who could read cuneiform to process quickly. They were catalogued and sorted as best as the resources of the time allowed. And then, in 1872, a young man named George Smith, who had taught himself to read cuneiform by spending every spare hour he had in the museum's collection, a man who had started his working life as a banknote engraver's apprentice, who had no university degree and no formal academic training, who was driven purely by an appetite for knowledge that nothing could satisfy. George Smith sat down with a fragment from the Nineveh collection, began to read, and felt the world tilt beneath him. The fragment he was reading was part of a story. A story about a great flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity. A story about one man chosen to survive, instructed to build a great boat and fill it with animals. A story about the waters rising until every mountain was covered, about a dove sent out to find dry land, about the boat finally coming to rest on a mountaintop as the waters receded. George Smith had read the Bible. He knew the story of Noah. And what he was reading on this baked clay tablet from the ruins of Ashurbanipal's library in Nineveh was the same story, or rather, an older version of the same story, written down centuries before the biblical account, in the middle of the great epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest work of literature in human history. He became so overwhelmed in that moment, so completely overcome by the magnitude of what he was holding, that witnesses later reported he stood up, began pacing the room, and started removing his clothes in the middle of the museum floor without being fully aware that he was doing it. It is one of the most endearing and entirely human moments in the history of scholarship. A man so electrified by knowledge that his body simply could not contain the feeling and had to do something, anything, to release it. The discovery sent shockwaves through Victorian society. The idea that the biblical flood story had a Mesopotamian predecessor, that Noah's Ark had an older twin in a pagan Babylonian poem, challenged religious assumptions and ignited debates that filled the newspapers and lecture halls of London for months. George Smith became famous almost overnight, a working-class self-taught genius suddenly celebrated by the same academic establishment that had previously ignored him. He was funded to travel to Nineveh himself to search for more tablet fragments, and he found them, proving not just his scholarship but his extraordinary instinct for the material he loved. Ashurbanipal's library, slowly reconstructed from its tens of thousands of fragments, turned out to be one of the most important single discoveries in the entire history of archaeology. Not because of the gold or the monuments or the spectacular visual drama that other ancient sites offered, but because of what it contained. Knowledge. The preserved, organized, deliberately gathered knowledge of one of the greatest civilizations the ancient world had ever produced, saved from oblivion by a burning building and a layer of Iraqi soil and the patient, brilliant, obsessed work of scholars who refused to let the past stay silent. Today, the tablets from Ashurbanipal's library are held primarily in the British Museum in London, where ongoing work continues to identify, translate, and understand them. New fragments are still being matched to known texts. New readings are still being proposed and debated. And occasionally, a scholar sitting at a desk with a broken piece of baked clay in front of them reads a line that has not been read by any human being for 2,500 years, and feels, in that moment, exactly what George Smith felt in 1872. The floor tilting. The room going quiet. The impossible, overwhelming, deeply human sense of reaching across an enormous gulf of time and finding, on the other side of it, someone reaching back. Ashurbanipal wanted to collect all the knowledge in the world. He did not succeed. No one ever has, and no one ever will. But he got closer than anyone before him. And what he saved, in those carefully ordered rooms in his great palace at Nineveh, was not just the knowledge of his own civilization. He saved something larger. He saved the proof that the need to gather knowledge, to preserve it, to share it across time with people not yet born, that need is not modern. It is not the product of the printing press or the internet or any particular technology or era. It is ancient. It is human. It is as old as the first city and the first written word and the first king who looked at everything his civilization had learned and thought, quietly and with great seriousness, that it would be a terrible thing to let any of it be lost. He was right. And the library he built, buried under the ruins of his burned palace for 2,500 years, is the proof. Some things are simply too important to stay lost forever.